Greeting everyone. So thank you everyone for joining me to this talk or unconference. Very happy to see some people also interested in qualitative work, which is less commonly having focus in psychology. My name is Veli-Matti Karhulahti. I'm from University of Jyväskylä, which is in Finland. And here the goal of this unconference is three. First, to gather interested people together, which we already have done. So please, if you are interested in working on this qualitative registered report efforts in the future as well, you can click the link in the chat, add your name and email, and then I'll be writing you afterwards. If you can't see the link, I will be posting it also after doing some of these slides in the beginning. Maybe it will take about 10 to 15 minutes with my initial slides. Then we'll be moving to the discussion part. I have prepared some questions, but I'm also very interested in hearing from your personal experiences or perspectives. What are those things that should be discussed when we talk about moving qualitative research into the registered report format? And then finally, if we have still time left, let's talk about those future approaches and again, everything that won't fit these 45 minutes. I will be writing back to you in the email list that is in the Google Doc. So thank you again, everyone, for joining. We'll do introductions maybe if we are not so many. After these slides, we can do a small round, but first a little bit about myself. So again, my name is Veli-Matti Karhulahti. You can just call me Matti, from Finland, and technically I'm a senior researcher, but really in reality I'm an early career researcher still. I've been working with 1 and 2 year grants my whole life, and still I'm very far from anything like a tenure position. I do interdisciplinary research, mostly on technology use and play in particular. Over the past years, increasingly also meta science. And my background is in the art, theory and philosophy, and I use many kinds of methods, including qualitative methods. So I'm very interested in working across fields and methods and disciplines. I'm not technically a psychologist. I do supervise psychology master students and teach psychology classes and publish in psychology journals, but I don't have an official degree in psychology. Everyone who is here, I assume you are familiar with the registered report format in general, so I won't go through that in detail, but just to summarize, the idea of registered report publication format is that authors, editors, and reviewers agree on the study design at stage 1, so there will be peer review of the idea and design. And after we have agreed on these things, the authors start working, collecting and the data and analyzing it. And then there will be a second peer review after that. So then we will be checking collectively whether the authors have worked as planned. There are hundreds of registered reports already out there using the so-called traditional format, using statistical methods. But to my knowledge, there are not many, if any, registered reports applying explicitly a full qualitative design. So if you are familiar with any of such pieces, please share them in the chat or write down in the document. There would be really fascinated about learning from those pieces. When we move to use the qualitative approach in the registered report format, there are several challenges surfacing from this combination, and for the lack of time, I have listed 3. There are probably more, and we can talk about those others later. But I start by briefly talking about these 3 things, which are data, epistemology, and flexibility. Using the interview method as an example, I think perhaps the biggest challenge in general for using the registered report format in qualitative approaches is the sharing of data. So most qualitative research still don't share the data for many good reasons. Usually in a qualitative design, we would use continuous consent. So the participants are contacted multiple times. They are given multiple consent options, which means that different parts of the data from the participants would be accessible in multiple ways. There can be different types of data, which might have, again, different sharing options. If we are researching participants and populations that are not English, we have a lot of work related to translation and back translation, including multi-stage cleaning. So if we're going to anonymize or pseudonymize data such as interview transcripts, it involves a lot of work. We need to be sure that people can't be identified, or identification would be really involving a minimal risk. And usually this involves member checking, so collaborating with the participants to make sure that these things are all in order. Finally, it usually requires collaborating with a professional archive. So the archive will have experts who will verify that all these stages have been taken care of, and they will also be controlling the access to the data. So at least if you're living in Europe, you're under GDPR, and usually it is advised and also demanded that, especially if you're working with sensitive types of data such as health data or data related to sexuality, you're not supposed to just dump it to an open archive, but the access should be controlled. Also in a secure environment. And all these steps take so much resources, expertise, and time and labor, literally thousands or tens of thousands of euros if you have a large data set that most teams working with qualitative methods are not simply able to share the data, which doesn't really allow in the registered report format the reviewers and editors to verify many of these steps that are basically required to be verified. Second, epistemology. If you're in social media following, for instance, the science feeder, you maybe saw this screenshot some weeks ago or days ago. I specifically didn't put the reference here, but it is a study from 1940, a psychology study where a researcher wanted to ask participants whether a certain piece of music evokes certain feelings. And the irony, of course, is for instance, in the green part, where the researcher received a response, explicit no from one participant, but interpreted that as an implied yes. And many people pointed out how this can be a form of very robust p-hacking, transparent p-hacking. But at the same time, I think it represents very much of the real challenges of doing qualitative research and communicating qualitative research. It is quite well known that for instance, in interview research, you will get responses that are not binary responses, such as yes and no. A lot of qualitative research, the beauty of qualitative research is that it can enter these kinds of complexities. For instance, if you're working with children, quite often you can get responses that you know as a researcher being in that context that what the participants tell you is exactly the opposite of what they mean. And how to communicate these kinds of epistemological challenges to the reviewers and editors and readers eventually forms a really, I think, big challenge in qualitative designs when we're talking about interpreting human participants. If we draw limits at stage one, how do we verify those interpretations at stage two? This applies to some degree also to many quantitative approaches, but in qualitative research, to a larger extent, many would agree. Finally, flexibility. So there's a lot of text. You can skip most of that. I highlighted one question here as an example. This is from Jennifer Mason's classic book, Qualitative Researching. In qualitative research, it is quite widely agreed as well that the researchers have to apply a lot of flexibility because unlike in many quantitative approaches, we don't know what is going to happen and how will the data surface. We don't collect data, we generate data. This one question here as an example: does my own written or tape recorded account and do my written or tape recorded field notes, which are based on my interpretations of what went on, count as data? These are questions that could basically be controlled by a registered report format. At stage one, there can be clear borders drawn around how certain sources will be applied, but is this overly limiting? Those are the questions that we need to answer. How much flexibility should be restricted for the registered report format to be useful for qualitative researchers? Is this a waste of time for everyone? That's one of those questions. Also related to those previous epistemological issues, that if we have good evidence, different types of knowledge, different types of data that clearly support interpreting a participant's response in a different way, are we allowed to use that? And how do we draw those limits at stage one? These kinds of questions. My final slide before we move to talk about these things is sort of a visualization of, I don't know how to call that, maybe kind of a full design or methodological forest. So quite often, as I have also done now previously in this talk, we use the terms qualitative research and quantitative research as a binary, but obviously that doesn't hold very, very far. As an example, those orange boxes, if we are interested in researching humans using an interview method, using a semi-structured sub-method, and producing data such as transcripts, before we even get to that point of analysis, we have a garden of forking paths where we have a lot of steps to take, and none of these steps are essentially qualitative or quantitative, but these are just research decisions that are part of the design, and any of these could be analyzed both qualitatively and quantitatively. And even many of these methods that are often considered part of the qualitative toolbox, such as codebook analysis and coding reliability analysis, they are essentially quantitative methods, not qualitative methods. You could easily use that for hypothesis testing and significance testing, and it's not easy to draw lines between qualitative and quantitative. And maybe when we talk about the registered report format in the qualitative sense, maybe a better way to distinguish between these challenges between methodologies is to say that maybe there are statistical, interpretive, and reflexive epistemologies, and when it comes to the first two, they seem to benefit quite well from the registered report format. But when we move to reflexive epistemologies, where, for instance, the researcher's subjective position is taken very strongly into account in the analysis, maybe these are things that cannot really be controlled by the registered report format and should not be controlled. But as long as we stay in the interpretive domain, where we make interpretations and we justify our interpretations based on evidence that is somehow presentable as data, as we also do in many statistical methods, we seem to be on the safe side from this perspective. A lot of statistical approaches also rely on interpretive kind of decisions. So when we define our alpha levels, or when we define our smallest effect sizes of interest, they are not right decisions. They are just better and worse decisions, and it remains a matter of interpretation which one we end up with. So maybe this could be the approach to some solutions. But I think I've spent my 10 minutes by now, so I would be happy to Before going into my explicit questions, I'd be very happy to hear people's own experiences and perspectives and ideas, what they think about using the registered report format for qualitative studies. Does it make sense? And if yes or no, why? Why so? So everyone, maybe I stop sharing. I do have a question slide here as well, but maybe stopping sharing will make it more comfortable for people to talk. Let's see if we are not so many, or maybe we actually start with we're not so many. So could we do a really quick introduction round? That would be maybe we still have enough time to do that. Maybe we start with Helena. We are known from a previous
Hey, Matti. Yeah, no, I think this is really interesting. Myself and Phil Bacalier, who's here, we recently wrote a paper about registered reports in pedagogical research, and the reviewers came back and asked us, so they were both qualitative researchers from a more social psychological perspective, social science perspective, sorry, than a psychology perspective, and they both asked us to put in extra parts about qualitative research, because obviously that is something that happens in pedagogical research quite a lot. So we then, how do we look at the literature and stuff like that? And I think it's mostly just to speak for why this is important, because what we found in the literature related to medical research mostly, there's been some papers that said that there seems to be a lot in medical research, and so it's kind of more the psychology version of it. It's kind of like interventions and things like that, where people have collected qualitative data and they compared what was presented at conferences compared to what they made it into the peer-reviewed literature, and they were talking about the fact that a lot is lost from the knowledge base because of poor methodology. And so for us, that just seems like a no-brainer. It's kind of like, if you can use registered reports or any kind of thing where people are given the chance to put their methods out there for somebody else to critique in some way, that's probably going to end up with much more of this work ending up in the literature, in the knowledge base. And I think that's quite a motivating factor for for pushing for things like registered reports.
Thank you. I fully agree. That's probably one of the greatest benefits of registered reports, as far as I see it, is the coaching that you get from stage one. You're just missing so much things. Just even if you have a big team, you cannot see things from the inside as well as other people, editors and reviewers, can from the outside, and you will be fixing so many not necessarily flaws, but things that could be improved before you start working. And quite often it seems to come to the question of time and effort, that people just want to jump straight into work, because it can also be a matter of resources. If you don't have that time, and if you have a team who is hired from a funding from a certain time span, you can't afford to wait that 3 months before you can start working. And as a solution to this challenge, I may add, the PCI registered reports, for instance, offers the opportunity to start collecting data during the stage one review. So you don't analyze the data yet, but you can start collecting participants as long as you don't do major modifications regarding the collection or generation process of data. But yeah, thank you, Helena, for this. Should we jump to Phil?
I was hoping you wouldn't do that. I think Helena stole everything I was going to say. I do the writing, she does the ideas, and you know, I love you. No, I think, to be honest, I was just really interested in the session because I've been really interested in registered reports from a quant perspective for a while now, and we've used them as a teaching tool within our research labs. So instead of just like kind of getting people to focus on what is the actual output, we really tried to get them back to think about what's the actual question and the methodology, and to really change the idea of, well, this is going to be a quant project, this is going to be a qual project. And it's kind of like what you were saying, Matty, that idea of like, you take the approach that best answers your research question, not because like I am a qual or I am a quant person. And I've actually managed to get this far in my career with never doing qual studies. So I'm actually started to retrain a bit more into qual and lead a few more qual projects. And in the open science field, I've kind of been much more a fan of registered reports than things like pre-registration, just because I think personally that there's just too much scope with pre-registration for people to play fast and loose with it a little bit. So I think, yeah, it's just really interesting for me to see how all kind of research methods and studies can be improved by registered reports. And just as Helena was saying, it came up in our reviews for our paper, and it was just kind of to hear people from like yourself about kind of what you think can be done in qual sort of approach. Like, honestly, from my perspective, is anything that you can have reviewed by another group of people before you start your study is beneficial to the research. Well, should be beneficial to the research in the long run, assuming that people are reviewing it properly. So it's kind of, I'm here as a lurker to some degree. I hope that's okay.
It's perfectly okay. Thank you all of that input. I even feel sometimes a little bit, it feels it's unfair for the reviewers getting all that valuable knowledge for them for free at stage one. It seems somehow as one of the big problems for registered reports in the long term as a whole, that how can we expect that input coming from the reviewers to such an extensive degree, whether it is qualitative or quantitative, because the time that when I look back to those reviews that we received over the past couple of papers, it was just so even the usual reviewer input is quite extensive. You can get excellent reviews that help you improve your papers, but in the registered report format, you will be getting up to 6 and 7 rounds, and they follow you even after all those steps and still keep giving, and they are not credited as authors usually. So it feels like as an ethical, yeah.
I was just thinking while you're talking there, whether it's actually worthwhile then thinking about processes that would credit the reviewers. Like, I know people already started that in other places. It's not standard process, but it does seem like the peer review process is starting to shake its foundations a little bit, because people are investing so much time and effort for effectively free labor without any credit. And I think a lot of people could actually benefit from the credit. So going ahead, if registered reports do take off, you could imagine a situation where at least getting some acknowledgement that you were one of the reviewers on this process would be kind of good for everyone.
Yeah, definitely. And at least I guess different journals have different solutions for this, but the PCIRR at least provides like an open review where each author is credited explicitly for their work, and it will be documented and openly shared. So you can get that. But on an institutional level, I would say it's probably not your employer doesn't care about whether you are one of those reviewers. So that's something that will take more time.
Well, I think in this journal that Phil and I are involved in, the editor there is pretty good, because one of the things that she's trying to encourage is more openness regarding the reviewers. And so she's actually invited us to eventually be joint authors on one of the papers that we're reviewing, because it has so many issues with it. So it's going to take quite a bit of work for that. And she was offering, well, one way forward in this is to do that. And I think there can be more things like that. So that one's a more quant one, but I think in qualitative research particularly, it's thinking about, you were talking about the epistemology there, and where people come and where they place themselves within the research. Well, you're going to be affected by what reviewers say. So it's kind of like really upfront acknowledging that this is now not just me being the researcher here, but actually these are all the people that are contributing, and having that contribution more widely recognized. So it's things like, even if you can't have it in the journal, publishing as part of the pre-registration or the open source materials, or putting it on your OSF page as, you know, as an integral part of it, and that being linked so that people can get the benefits of that and the acknowledgement of that. But yeah, no, I think that is a really important thing, though, because registered reports and doing that takes a lot more. But at the same time, I think it's actually really reasonable for a reviewer to say things like, actually, this is not very well done, and at this stage, I don't want to put in a huge amount of time. And, you know, so it could be something like multiple stages where this isn't very well organized. These are maybe 3 or 4 points that absolutely have to be addressed. These are my high level comments. Once they are addressed, I'll look at it again. And so it could be things like that, rather, and then at a more, you know, when the research is more organized or more well rounded and things like that, that's a stage at which it's more reasonable to say, okay, now I will be putting in extra time. So I think that's the other thing to consider as well, is it's sort of like, is this review process, you know, maybe it's better to have multiple review rounds and for those to be smaller comments rather than, you know, or overall comments rather than the very detailed stuff that we tend to do in reviews.
Yeah, more like a dialogue rather than a statement coming out of source. That's definitely, yeah, more preferable, more useful for the researchers as well, because you can't handle, when you get that 20-page review statement, you can't handle that. I experienced that sometimes, sometimes the reviewer really wants to do their job well, and you get 20 pages of revisions, and half of them are things that you not necessarily agree with, and half of them are excellent, and then you end up in this never-ending loop where the editor is in a really uncomfortable position where they need to kind of, especially if it's not a registered report, but it's just they need to decide, accept or reject the binary decision. So it can get really difficult. So yes, a dialogue format reviewing is improving. Should we, does somebody want to jump in at this point?
I can. Hi everybody, I'm Joan, and good to see Helena and Phil. I'm just down the road from them. I think I'm here also sort of in the capacity of an observer, active observer, learner. I have moved to education a few years ago, and coming from a mostly quant background, I have started again retraining more in qual, and I have a few PhD students working on qualitative projects and a whole bunch of master students who often like working on qualitative projects, and I have started since leading some qualitative projects as well, just because they fit with the education sort of research better. So I'm very curious to really learn how, you know, how this idea can be applied to qualitative work. I have started sort of promoting a bit of open science practices in education and linking to qualitative research. So some of the ideas you were talking about at the beginning in terms of, you know, the issues around confidentiality of data, you know, sharing data, consent. You know, we run some amazing workshops with Isabel Steinhardt, who is doing a lot of work on data sharing and qualitative work in education, that has been very helpful and sort of quite eye-opening on some of the issues that are very particular and very peculiar for qualitative, especially, you know, sensitive data and qualitative work. Yeah, so I'm sort of taking it all in today. So thanks so much for organizing.
Thank you for being here. Excellent. At least Ilker as well has a camera on, so maybe I'll.
Thank you for organizing this session. Actually, unfortunately, I don't have any experience in qualitative research. All my training was about or include quantitative research, but I'm interested in registered reports, and I am here to learn the challenges and opportunities of this registered reports in the qualitative research. That's why I'm sure I don't have any experience to share, but I hope I can learn a lot from you.
Thank you for being here, and no need. There are no expectations on any of the participants for being here. I really think it's valuable just to get multiple perspectives and have people on board. We have Andre just turned the camera on, so welcome to.
Hi, I'm Andre. So I work in the research department of like an infrastructure charity. So my background's also mostly on stuff, but we do lots. What we actually do is mostly qualitative methods. A lot of, sorry, they could probably hear me better now. Yeah. A lot of the stuff we do, we get kind of commissioned, and then publications like a kind of an afterthought. And then when we go and try and get published, you can kind of tell. I think that's this seems like a really interesting thing. I don't know. It would be nice if we could have that happening before we do all the data collection, but it seems super hard because I think often one of the valuable things about what we're doing is that it's just really fast. You know, like we did loads of stuff during COVID about we can go gather data immediately on a specific stage of what's happening right now during this phase, and that seems hard in the context of a registered report. But excited to be here.
One of the things that I can just raise maybe as a point of discussion is the academic rigor, because coming from a quant background, I was always slightly dubious about the academic rigor in qualitative work. And one thing I was always interested in how we can ensure and increase academic rigor. And I think registered report is something that can give you this clear structure and this kind of clear guidance of what you can, what you can't do, and kind of limit the degree of subjectivity potentially in your interpretation as well. And I wonder what your thoughts on this are.
I believe that's so we know that if we look at the top journals on any field, they don't generally publish qualitative work at all, and I believe that is the reason for it. It is that it is very difficult for the editors, and not only the lack of so-called impact that they don't necessarily make a generalizable conclusion that will be valuable in the future, but also the fact that the editors and the reviewers can't really verify those interpretations that are being made by the qualitative studies. So the rigor that we have, unless we use really strong some sort of interreliability coding, and we can share all those materials, then we can reach a level where I think also the top journal editors would agree with the rigor. But maybe there are some people have argued that there are different terms to be used in qualitative research, such as what were those terms? Maybe others remember better than I do, but some sort of at least validity is something that is not being considered, that is considered important in quant studies, but not in qual studies. We can't validate our interpretations necessarily to the same degree. But for instance, our methodology could be very much replicable. So if we explicitly state how we did our collection or generation and its analysis, who did what at what point, and why did we end up in these conclusions, sharing the process, not only the outcome, but those steps, that this was our first round of interpretation and coding. This was our second round. This is how it evolved from this scratch to the next level and next level. That could be something that helps in reaching that rigor that is needed. Also, position analysis statements, I think, are quite important. Also, especially in registered reports. So before you start collecting or generating data and analyzing it, you make a very explicit positionality statement. What is your knowledge regarding previous literature? And even though you cannot test hypotheses, you can make it clear to the reviewers and editors that this is where I come from, or this is where we come from, and here we can kind of make sure that if there are subjective kind of interpretations lured in, which quite often there is, and that's normal, that's part of all study designs, at least when we make them explicit before reaching the results section, that might help in getting to the
Matti, could I ask then, sorry, I was just, in terms of thinking about a qual registered report, what would be the baseline things that you would note down in the registered report? Because I imagine if you're doing a quant, you know, like, you know exactly the layout of the study, and to some degree you almost kind of submit the analytical plan and maybe simulated data or something like that. So if you could imagine, I guess you've done a couple in the past as well, if you could do a qual registered report, what would be the kind of the standard or limitations, or kind of, yeah, what would be the kind of, what would you include in it? Like, I guess that's it. But in my head, I'm a bit like, you wouldn't write down all questions, right? Because obviously in some of the kind of approaches, some of the questions formulate themselves in the middle of the approach. But would you start off with, like, we are going to start with like a focus group with 3 basic questions, or an interview with 3 basic questions, and that's the level that the registered report goes into? I guess I'm just trying to get in my head how it would work a bit.
Yeah, so we have one qual registered report that is at stage 1. It has IPA, so we haven't published the final product yet, but it's it was approved after stage 1, and we did have the full questionnaire ready. So we had 54 questions, or basically we had 12 big questions, and then we had for each a number of follow-up questions that, and as you said, we cannot follow that structure exactly by just asking, but if people make responses that are highly surprising or interesting, we will follow that lead instead of sticking with that rigid question structure. And we are open with that, so I think that it should be okay. In terms of the positionality statement, we wrote about our own backgrounds and the literature that we read, which makes us believe that these kinds of people will respond in these kinds of ways. Of course, like, there is no word limit for that, so you could write a full article based on that. So there are some practical limits for it, but I think the key points could be included and should be included to be transparent.
That makes a lot of, yeah. I was just going to say that makes a lot of sense. And just even when you just sort of talk about that, it kind of makes a mockery of this idea of it not having rigor to some degree, you know, that kind of like you see in other kind of positions, because you are detailing as much as required to actually be detailed at that level, sort of thing. And if that kind of came on my table, I'd be like, no, I sort of, because I only ever review qual work from a kind of an ethics point of view. And that's where I really get kind of a sense of, obviously ethics to some degree is pre-registration. And then sometimes I see it where I'm a bit like, you're going to do an interview, but you're not telling me anything that you're going to ask about. Mm-hmm. And I'm a kind of like, me personally, from a quant background, that's kind of like a bit dubious for me. But like, it's interesting to hear that even from maybe a qual background, that's a bit dubious. You would never go in with just kind of, we're just going to ask questions. And I get the feeling when me and Helena were reviewing the literature, that was sort of some of the QRPs that were flagged out a little bit, in the sense that they would come out with analysis, like a thematic analysis, but there wasn't really kind of any indication of where the questions had come from. Yeah, and I think if it was my kind of viewpoint on kind of registered reports and qual, kind of just having that sort of basis of, this is our starting point, and kind of like what you said, where's your kind of your what viewpoint are you coming from? And like, what technique are you going to do? And I think when I was talking to one of my students about the other day, just being honest about how you're going to establish your participants, your sample, things like, because she was wanting to look at a very specific group of people, and it's really, there's only so many ways you can get that very specific group of people, because like only those specific group of people have had that experience, right? So it's kind of just, for me, it's about stating that clearly and getting someone else who's knowledgeable to actually look at it and go like, yeah, this is exactly what you should do. It seems obvious, right?
Yeah. Samples. Yeah, please go ahead, Helen.
I was just following on a train from what you were saying and what Phil was saying is kind of like, yeah, so the sample size, those are things that you can do. But I'm quite liking this idea that instead of having an introduction, you might be able to have a position statement. So if you're looking at a registered report, your introduction and position statement would kind of be interrelated. So instead of looking at it as a traditional kind of write-up where you have an introduction, literature review, all those kinds of things, it's much more targeted towards this is the position that we're taking, so that literature response can actually come much more in the discussion where it is more appropriate anyway for qualitative research. So it's maybe even like changing the language around reporting. The reason this comes up is because Phil and I try to teach qualitative to people from our quant background. And so the typical way that quantitative people do that is kind of like, okay, so we have our nice quant report. So how do we write something in qualitative that's exactly like that? Okay, and that obviously is a problem. Hey, we've got a new visitor. But so I think even kind of like at the very, even that could send a very strong message that this is a different kind of approach. We can't really use what's in quant in exactly the same way, but even changing the language around how we approach writing up something like this might help people to understand the difference.
Yeah, that is excellent. I think the language is definitely one of the key points, that we need to kind of reinvent the language for these things in order to not be fooled by the illusion that we would need to have those same things. I must note at this point that we are now 1 minute over time. So Savannah, how are we allowed to go over time, or will this be shutting down? How do we proceed?
You are allowed to take up as much time as in 90 minutes that technically is allotted for this slot, except for like you said that you would do 40. Like, we are not rushed for time. The next session starts in like 50 minutes. So if y'all want to keep talking, y'all keep talking.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That's great. If somebody is in a hurry or schedule something else, feel free to jump out and move onwards. The link, I think it should be there, but I will post it again. So you can just drop your name in the Google Doc if you need to go, and then you can be part of the further work. But for those who still have the time, so yeah, it's we still have a couple of people who haven't introduced themselves. Do you want to do that? I don't want to force anyone to do that, but feel free to jump in. At least Mia got her camera on.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Mia Siltila. I'm a PhD student in University of Turku, Finland, and I also work as a researcher in one of Matti's projects in the University of Jyväskylä, Finland.
Yes, thank you, Mia. If the next step would be to discuss what are those critical points that we would need to include. Firstly, like I would like to ask all of you, do you think we need guidelines? Are there already too many guidelines around there? I feel like whenever somebody's writing guidelines, I feel there's already 20 guidelines here and there. Do you think we need to work on some of those, or is it just too much more information in the internet that nobody will read or need anyway?
Sorry, I have to go in a minute, but the main thing about guidelines is, as far as I can tell, for qualitative research, is that they're not necessarily going to be that helpful, because the approach, the different kinds of way that you do qualitative research requires so many different things. And I think it comes from the, sorry, my language in this is a bit poor because I'm not a qualitative researcher, but speaking to colleagues who have done this, it's kind of like there's, if you're coming from an IPA perspective, there are certain kinds of things that you would do for transparency. If you're coming from a grounded theory perspective, I think that's one of them. There would be maybe other things, but the thing is that you actually need experts in qualitative research that can make those guidelines. So maybe what's more helpful is finding examples or finding why things haven't worked, or finding, it's those examples of how it can be made to work better, rather than trying to make guidelines, because I think they would be too narrow. I think basically the reason there was such a long conversation about registered reports, it took, I don't know, I think about 5 years to settle for it to become more than that, to become something. And that was because it was so difficult for people to formulate an idea of how you actually turn that thing that you're used to doing into something where you pre-plan it all beforehand. So it was quite a slow process. Now, I think a lot of things from my experience of people who do qual, that a lot of that is already planned already. It's just that there's no way to articulate it for them. So it's more this kind of like, what is a broad kinds of, I've done it in this perspective, like you've done it, Matti. So it's a kind of like how, what were the things that came across? How could you make it better for the next people? How could you use your, what you said that you had lots and lots of things from peer reviewers. So how could you actually make that process easier for them? How could you, what are the things that you can take? So it's maybe much more at a higher level to be thinking about, just kind of like, is there journals that would take it, and what can we say to journals at this stage about this? And then the editors within there start figuring out how you're going to actually approach this and do it. So yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that Phil and I were doing, because it was a kind of like, it's like, how do you even take registered reports into some of the fields where qualitative is being used?
Yeah, thanks for. I know you need to run in a minute, so I fully sign all that. And I was just thinking what you said, Helena, earlier about the language, that if we don't need to call it a guideline, but just advice of how to use language in general would be more useful to people, rather than having a checklist for things. So.
A glossary of qualitative research for registered reports or something like that.
Yeah, a glossary sounds good.
Yeah. Qualitative registered reports glossary. That might even a start, like small things. I think, because I don't even know all the language that is helpful for this, but yeah. Oh no, don't say brilliant ideas, mainly. This is the problem that I had, because in the summer we were in another meeting and we committed to write a paper, and I'm struggling with that, so.
But I think it's also more accessible to people. If you write a 10-page guidelines, nobody's going to read it. But if you have a glossary, it is something that if it's been organized, for instance, to sample size questions or questions, but points, what to do with them, and then things about language and so on and so on. So this will be very useful and easily accessible to a lot of people.
Okay, and actually I have some tools that we can share about that. Lisa De Bruyn does a lot of work for sorting things for us in the School of Psychology here at Glasgow. And she has a RMD template for making glossaries. So I might be able to share that actually. In fact, what I'll do that now before I go, and you can have a look, because you can just download it and start using it and things like that. But she has a template for setting that up and we can use it. Yeah, Lisa's brilliant. Really, really useful friend to have. She does so much for us. But yeah, I'll do that before I go, and then you can.
Sounds good. I will add it to the Google Doc as well. So if it's going to the chat, I'll just do that right away. What about so this sounds like a plan for future. Do others still have critical things that could be included in this sort of a glossary approach planning? Are there things that we should take into consideration, questions that we need to answer in order to make it easier for editors and reviewers and authors to work on this as well, if they would like to? We also heavily over time, so we can also start wrapping up for now. If we reached I think most of the goals that were set in the beginning, so it seems great. And feel free to invite anyone if you know people and who are interested and who are experts related to these things. Again, in the qualitative domain in particular, there are so many different ways of doing things that it would really benefit from people who have done things differently. So if you know people, just share the link to the Google Doc, and then we will get their name and email, and we'll be much wiser when we are more. So just feel free to do that. Thank you. Now I got the link to the chat. That looks very promising. Just add this link to the Google Doc, to the literature part.
Is the Google Doc linked in the booklet? / should we add it to the booklet in case people want to go back?
That's a brilliant idea. Definitely should. It's not there. I just realized. So I don't have the edit rights for the booklet, but if you can do that, that would be excellent.
Yeah. I can add that.
Okay. Great. So if you still have some thoughts, you are free to share them. And if not, then let's move to the next session. And I will be writing everyone who left their name and email on the doc over the next days, and plan maybe a time for a separate meeting when people have the opportunity to find the time, and we can keep advancing with this. Thanks again for everyone for joining. That was great. Very happy to see also a lot of people interested in qual work, and maybe one day we can start some sort of a multi-site qual project here in the PSA. I think those things have not been done yet in psychology, at least. There are no multi-site qualitative studies to my knowledge. If there are, always feel free to add any of those details into the Google Doc, in the literature list. I would be very happy to learn from them. But yeah, thanks again, and enjoy the rest of the conference.